The splintered door crashed inward, kicked open by a mud-caked boot. Kiko squeezed her eyes shut, pressing herself flat against the damp earth floor, her body rigid with anticipated new terror. She heard them, deep, guttural shouts in English. The devils had come. She was burning with fever, her infected arm a throbbing mass of pain, but all of it vanished, replaced by the singular, overwhelming certainty of her death. A large shadow fell over her. She flinched as a hand roughly grabbed her shoulder, not to violate, but to turn her over. She opened her eyes. A tall Marine, his face grim with exhaustion and smeared with camouflage paint, stared down at her. He saw the filth, the other women cowering in the dark, and then he saw her arm, swollen and dark red. His expression changed. It was not lust. It was not even anger. It was something else. Disgust, perhaps, but not at her. "Corman!" he bellowed over his shoulder, stepping back, creating distance. "Get the corpsman. We got sick ones." Another figure knelt beside her, this one wearing a helmet with a red cross. He carried a medical bag. He smelled sharply of antiseptic. He ignored her filthy kimono, his focus locking onto her infected arm. He began cleaning it with alcohol, his touch impersonal, clinical, yet shockingly gentle. Kiko watched, breathless, as he prepared a glass vial and a needle, a syringe of penicillin. He looked at her face, saw her terror of the needle, and paused. He held it up, then nodded slowly, a silent question. He was waiting. Kiko stared, her fever-addled mind unable to process. This devil was asking her permission. The realization shattered her. He was not a beast. He was a healer. This simple act of decency, this refusal to treat her as anything less than a patient, broke the final dam of her indoctrination. As he administered the shot, Kiko began to sob, a deep, racking, uncontrollable sound that tore from her chest. A third soldier, younger, watched her, his own face pale. He took a gray wool blanket from his pack, unfolded it, and draped it over her shaking shoulders. This unexpected warmth, this profound act of non-violation, was the most shocking thing she had ever experienced. 6 weeks earlier, Koza, Okinawa. The whirring of the sewing machines was the only sound that competed with the radio. In the stifling humidity of the Koza civilian workshop, Kiko kept her head down, feeding rough burlap cloth under the jumping needle. The air smelled of machine oil, sweat, and the faint, sweet scent of the hibiscus flowers wilting just outside the window. It was early 1945. The radio, perched on the foreman's desk like a dark idol, was never silent. "The Gaijin Akuma," the announcer's voice crackled, sharp and metallic. "Do not take prisoners. They are beasts who feed on the innocent. Their bloodlust is known. They will desecrate your daughters and mock your ancestors." Kiko's foot faltered on the treadle. A girl 2 rows down whimpered, earning a sharp glare from the Imperial Army liaison officer supervising them. He was an older man, too frail for the front line, whose new duty was to shepherd this flock of civilian women. "Silence," the officer snapped, though not unkindly. He walked over and lowered the radio's volume, but he did not turn it off. "You must listen. You must understand what we are fighting. This is Gyokusai, 100 million souls preferable to surrender." Kiko hated the radio. It was a voice of constant, creeping dread. It painted pictures in her mind of giants covered in hair, of violence so profound she could not truly imagine it, yet feared it implicitly. That fear was now more real to her than the American B-29s that passed overhead, too high to see, leaving only silver trails in the blue. After the shift, as the women filed out, the officer stopped them. "The front line moves closer," he said, his voice now attempting to sound reassuring. "It is not safe for women to be unescorted. The beasts will be here before the moon changes again." He looked at them, his gaze lingering on the youngest, including Kiko. "However, the army provides. We are establishing support centers in protected compounds, places of safety. You will have food, protection, and the honor of serving the Emperor's men in a time of crisis." Kiko looked down, relief washing over her. A protected compound. Safety. It was the answer to the terror the radio had built. If she went there, the Gaijin Akuma could not reach her. She would be safe behind the walls of the Imperial Army. "Those who wish this protection," the officer said, "report to the transport depot tomorrow at dawn." Kiko did not realize it was an order, not an offer. She believed she was making a choice. The next morning she arrived as ordered, clutching a small bundle of clothes. The truck that picked her up did not take her to a fortress. It drove her to a nondescript farmhouse surrounded by a new, crude wooden fence far from the town. The sign on the gate did not say support center. It was simply a number. The protected compound was 3 damp rooms in a requisitioned farmhouse. The smell was the first thing that eroded her humanity. It was a thick, clinging odor of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, cheap sake, and disease. The paper screens of the doors had long since been torn, replaced with rough burlap that did little to keep out the mosquitoes or the humid, oppressive heat of the Okinawan spring. Kiko learned quickly that safety was a relative term. She was safe from the abstract terror of the Gaijin Akuma, only to be consumed by the immediate daily reality of the Emperor's soldiers. She learned to make herself small, to disconnect her mind from her body, to become a shadow on the stained tatami mats. The girl who had arrived clutching an omamori charm was gone, replaced by a creature that only registered survival. The injury happened during the 4th week. A sergeant, drunk and impatient, grabbed her. It was not a violent act of malice, but a casual assertion of ownership. Kiko, however, was startled, and her body tensed in a moment of involuntary resistance. Angered by the perceived defiance, the sergeant cursed and shoved her hard. Kiko fell sideways, her left forearm scraping violently against a splintered doorframe. A long, jagged gash tore open the skin, wood fragments embedding themselves in the flesh. She cried out, more from shock than pain. The sergeant merely grunted, finished his business, and left. There was no medicine. There was no clean water. Kiko could only watch, day after day, as the wound festered. The skin around it turned an angry red, then a sickly purple. A hot, throbbing pain began to radiate from her arm, and the fever set in. She drifted in and out of consciousness. In her delirium, the officer's voice from the radio returned, whispering of devils. She began to pray for the fever to take her, to die as a Japanese woman, before the other fate could find her. One evening, as she shivered on her thin futon, another woman approached. She was older, with hard eyes and a face that had seen too much. She was Korean, one of the women Kiko had been taught to look down upon, though here, they were all the same. The woman whose name Kiko thought was Sunyi knelt beside her. Sunyi produced a small porcelain cup and a bottle of sake, likely stolen from a soldier's discarded rations. Kiko flinched, thinking it was another violation, but Sunyi merely dipped a dirty rag into the strong alcohol. "Dame," Sunyi whispered, her Japanese broken. "Bad. Must clean." She began to dab at the wound. The sting was excruciating, pulling Kiko from her feverish haze with a sharp gasp. But Sunyi was methodical, her touch rough but not unkind. It was a futile gesture. The infection was too deep, the alcohol too weak, the rag too dirty. But it was the first human act Kiko had experienced in weeks. It did not matter. The infection was already in her blood. As Sunyi finished, Kiko's feverish gaze fell upon the Korean woman's face. She saw no pity, only a shared, exhausted despair. Kiko closed her eyes. She no longer feared death. She only feared the radio's prophecy. The fever held her captive for days. Her world shrank to the throbbing in her arm and the dampness of her futon. Then, a new sound cut through the haze. Not the rumble of Japanese trucks, not the drunken singing of soldiers. It was a sharp, cracking sound. Artillery. Close. It was followed by a sustained, rattling noise she did not recognize. Machine gun fire. And then shouting. Loud, booming voices. Not in Japanese. It was the language from the radio. The devils were here. The world outside the farmhouse exploded. The flimsy walls vibrated with the concussion of nearby mortars, shaking dust and straw from the low ceiling. Kiko heard the splintering crash of the main gate, followed by guttural alien shouts. The language was deep, harsh, and utterly terrifying. The voice of the Gaijin Akuma from the radio. The Japanese guards had vanished hours before, melting away at the first sound of the advancing American tanks, leaving the women alone. Now, there was nowhere to run. Kiko dragged her fever-racked body into the darkest corner of the back room, huddling behind a stack of empty sake crates. Sun Yi and two other women were already there, pressed together in a silent, trembling mass. Kiko's infected arm throbbed with a pain so intense it felt disconnected from her body, a hot, heavy weight. Her teeth chattered, partly from the fever, mostly from terror. She squeezed her eyes shut, her mind conjuring the images from the propaganda. The tall, hairy beasts, the tearing hands, the smell of rotten milk. She prayed not for rescue, but for a quick death. The door to their room was kicked open. It did not slide. It was torn from its hinges, crashing inward. Kiko stifled a scream. A figure blocked the doorway, silhouetted against the blinding white sunlight of the Okinawan afternoon. He was enormous, far larger than any Japanese man she had ever seen. He wore a helmet covered in mottled green cloth and carried a long rifle. Mud caked his boots and stained his trousers. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He saw them. Kiko tensed, her entire body locking down, waiting for the inevitable violation. This was it, the moment the radio had promised. The Marine, a private first class, though Kiko would never know this, stopped. He stared at the women huddled in the corner. His face, smeared with green and black camouflage paint and running with sweat, was grim. His knuckles were white on his rifle. He had been fighting non-stop for 12 days, had seen his friends die, and was expecting a house full of dug-in Japanese soldiers. Instead, he found this: filth, sickness, and a terror so profound it was almost a physical presence in the room. His eyes swept over them, then locked onto Kiko. He saw her, not as a woman, but as a casualty. He saw the unnatural flush of her skin, the vacant look of high fever, and the grotesque swelling of her left forearm, dark purple and seeping. Kiko met his gaze, her last bit of strength spent on bracing for the attack. The Marine did not move forward. He did not lower his rifle, but he did not raise it either. He just stood there. Then slowly, in a motion that felt impossibly deliberate, he took one measured step backward, putting distance between them. He had seen combat, but this was something else. This was pestilence. He turned his head slightly toward the door, never taking his eyes completely off the room. "Christ," he muttered under his breath. Then, louder, bellowing over the distant gunfire, "Corpsmen! Get the corpsmen in here! We got sick ones!" Kiko remained frozen. Her mind, foggy with fever and rigid with indoctrination, could not process what had just happened. The devil had seen her, and he had asked for a medic. The contradiction was so profound, so absolute, that her terror momentarily gave way to a vast, paralyzing confusion. Another figure appeared in the doorway, smaller than the first, moving with a different kind of urgency. This man did not carry a rifle. He carried a heavy canvas bag slung over one shoulder, marked with a large, starkly painted red cross. He wore the same helmet, same muddy uniform, but his focus was inward. He was a Navy corpsman. The first Marine pointed. Her, the arm. He then stepped aside, taking up a guard position near the door, his attention shifting back to the world outside. The corpsman knelt. Kiko flinched, pulling her legs instinctively toward her chest, her breath catching in her throat. The man was too close. He was the enemy, wearing the face of a healer. Kiko's mind raced. Was this part of the torture? A medical violation? The radio had said they were devious, but the corpsman did not look at her face. He did not look at her body, huddled in the filthy, torn kimono. He looked, with intense professional focus, at one thing and one thing only, her arm. Gently, but with firm, impersonal strength, he took her wrist. His touch was not a caress, not an assault. It was a clinical assessment. Kiko gasped at the sudden, cool contact, but she was too weak, too feverish to pull away. Tetanus, he murmured to himself, more a diagnosis than a conversation. He saw the wooden splinters still embedded, the dark lines of sepsis tracking toward her shoulder. He opened his medical bag. Kiko watched, her eyes wide and unfocused, as he laid out his instruments on a clean cloth. She saw metal, glass, bottles. They looked like tools of pain. He took a pair of tweezers and without ceremony began to pluck the largest splinters from her flesh. Kiko cried out, a thin, weak sound. Easy, easy, he said, his voice low and rough, not unkindly. He did not stop. He then uncorked a bottle. The sharp, clean, shocking smell of alcohol filled Kiko's nostrils, cutting through the room's stench of sickness. It was a smell from a life she had forgotten, a life of hospitals and order. He poured the alcohol directly onto a wad of cotton and began to clean the wound. The sting was a white-hot agony. It jolted Kiko from her feverish lethargy, a scream tearing from her throat. But the corpsman held her arm steady, cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency, his expression neutral, his movements economical. He was simply working. He was treating her not as a woman, not as a prize, not as an enemy, but as a wound. Kiko stopped screaming, her breath coming in ragged pants. This was not violation. This was treatment. The corpsman seemed satisfied. He packed the wound with a pale yellow sulfa powder, his fingers moving quickly. Then he reached back into his bag and took out a small, sealed glass vial filled with clear liquid and a separate, sterile syringe. He fitted the needle, tapped the glass, and drew the fluid up into the barrel. He held the syringe up to the sliver of light from the doorway. It was penicillin. Keiko had never seen it before. To her, it was just another terrifying, unknown instrument in the hands of the devil. The needle glinted. Kiko saw it, and her body reacted before her mind could. It was a primal, physical rejection. She recoiled violently, pulling her arm back with a sharp intake of breath, scrambling backward until her shoulders hit the rough earthen wall of the corner. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the syringe. Pain. Violation. The radio had warned her. The devils were devious. First they pretend to clean the wound, then they inject the poison. Or perhaps it was something else, some other defilement she could not even imagine. Her entire being, conditioned by months of abuse and weeks of propaganda, screamed no. The corpsman stopped. He did not lunge for her. He did not curse. He did not grab her arm and force the injection. He simply stopped. He remained kneeling, the syringe held steady in his hand, his gaze fixed on her. His eyes, Kiko saw, were not filled with lust or anger. They were blue and impossibly profoundly tired. He looked at her, then at the syringe, then back at her. He understood. In this frozen moment, the only sound was Kiko's ragged, feverish breathing and the distant, muffled pop of gunfire far down the road. The corpsman sighed, a short, quiet exhale. He held up the syringe, gesturing with it toward her swollen arm. "Medicine," he said. The word meant nothing to her. He tried again. He pointed at the festering wound, then pointed at the syringe, then gave a small, slow nod. His expression was not threatening. It was patient. He was waiting. Kiko stared at him, her mind fracturing. The cognitive dissonance was too much. This man, this Gaijin Akuma, held in his hand the power to end her, to poison her, to violate her in this new, terrifying way. And yet, he was asking her permission. No one had asked for her permission for anything in months. Not the Japanese soldiers who had treated her like property. Not the officers who had lied to her. Not even Sunyi, who had cleaned her wound out of a shared, desperate misery. This soldier, this enemy, this devil from the radio was refusing to touch her without her assent. This simple act of decency was more violent to her worldview than any physical blow could have been. It was an assault on the very foundation of her fear. The propaganda, the indoctrination, the certainty of her own dehumanization, it all shattered in the face of this one, quiet, humane gesture. Her terror did not vanish, but it was suddenly eclipsed by a vast, overwhelming confusion. Slowly, her body trembling with a mixture of fever, shock, and a new, unnameable emotion, Kiko unclenched her fist. She looked at her ravaged arm, then at the man. She stopped shrinking away from him. It was the only answer she could give. The corpsman understood. He nodded once, a quick, professional acknowledgement. "Okay, easy does it." He moved forward slowly, clinically. He took her forearm, his grip firm and impersonal, holding it steady. Kiko flinched again as the needle pricked her skin, a tiny, sharp sting that was nothing compared to the agony already in her arm. She watched, mesmerized, as he depressed the plunger, sending the clear liquid, the penicillin, into her bloodstream. He withdrew the needle, immediately applying pressure with a cotton swab. It was done. He had saved her. He had not violated her. The dam broke. A sound tore from Kiko's chest, a sound she did not recognize. It was not a scream of terror. It was a sob, a deep, racking, guttural wail that came from the very core of her being. It was the accumulated agony of the farmhouse, the fever, the fear, and the final, shocking, unbearable weight of an unexpected kindness. She wept uncontrollably, collapsing in on herself as the corpsman, looking startled and deeply uncomfortable, quickly packed his syringe and stood up. Kiko could not stop shaking. The racking sobs had subsided into a series of hitched, gasping breaths, but her body was betrayed by a violent tremble. It was the fever, the shock, the sudden, terrifying release of adrenaline, all colliding at once. She huddled in the corner, her knees drawn up, trying to make herself as small as possible. The corpsman had finished. He had done his job and was now speaking in low, rapid tones to the Marine who had found them, gesturing back toward the main compound. They were figures of authority, of power. Kiko was still their captive, still at their mercy. Another soldier, much younger than the first two, stood near the doorway. He looked barely older than Kiko herself, his face pale and slick with sweat beneath his helmet, his rifle held loosely at his side. He had been watching the encounter with the corpsman, his expression a mixture of confusion and deep discomfort. He watched Kiko tremble, her thin, filthy kimono offering no warmth, no protection. Her sobbing had been a terrible sound, one that did not belong in the middle of a firefight. He looked at the corpsman, then at the other Marine, as if seeking permission. Neither was paying attention to him. He made a decision. Keeping his distance, he unslung the bulky pack from his back. He fumbled with the straps, unrolling a tightly bound item. It was a gray wool blanket, standard issue, smelling faintly of damp canvas and the chemical scent of insect repellent. He did not approach Kiko directly. He did not want to frighten her again. Instead, he stepped forward just enough, his movement slow and deliberate, and held the blanket out. When she did not move, still trapped in her fugue state, he gently tossed it so that it landed across her huddled shoulders. Kiko flinched at the sudden contact, a small gasp escaping her, but the blanket did not strike her. It settled. It was heavy. The weight of it was immediate, surprising, a solid, tangible presence on her shoulders. Then came the warmth. The coarse wool was rough against her skin, but it held a dry, profound heat that began to seep through her damp clothes, pushing back against the chilling fever. She looked up at the young soldier. He was already backing away, his face averted, as if embarrassed by the gesture. He said nothing. He did not need to. Kiko's trembling hands instinctively rose, not to push the blanket off, but to pull it closer. She clutched the rough edges, burying her face in the folds. The smell, unfamiliar, utterly non-Japanese, filled her lungs. It was the smell of the enemy. Yet, it was the first true physical warmth she had felt in months that was not the burning of her own fever. She pulled the wool blanket tight around her, a shield against the cold, against the stares, against the impossible reality of the moment. Beneath its weight, her shaking began, ever so slightly, to subside. The penicillin was starting its work against the infection, and the blanket was starting its work against the shock. Hours later, a U.S. Army truck arrived. It was not a combat vehicle, but a simple transport. The soldiers who loaded them were different from the Marines. They seemed older, more detached, their movements weary and bureaucratic. Kiko, still wrapped tightly in the gray wool blanket, was helped onto the truck bed. The penicillin had broken her fever, leaving behind a dull throb in her arm and a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. They drove for miles through a landscape she did not recognize. The Okinawa she knew, the one of green hills, sugarcane fields, and small villages, was gone. It had been replaced by a churned brown wasteland, scarred by tank treads and pockmarked with shell craters. The air smelled of diesel and damp, turned earth. They arrived at a sprawling complex contained by high wire fences, but it was nothing like the farmhouse. This was a city of tents and crude shacks, teeming with thousands of people. The noise was a dull roar of voices, crying children, and shouted commands over loudspeakers. This was a civilian internment camp. As Kiko, Sunyi, and the other women were marched through the gates, a strange, localized silence fell over the Japanese civilians nearby. The internees, old men, mothers, children, were lining up for water, cooking over small fires, or simply sitting in the mud. They stopped. They stared. They knew instantly who these new women were. Their filth, their ragged kimonos, their haunted eyes, and the very fact that they were being escorted in as a separate group told the whole story. They were the women from the stations. The stares were not sympathetic. They were cold, sharp, and judgmental. In this new hierarchy of survival, Kiko and the others were at the absolute bottom. They were kegar, unclean, a living, breathing reminder of the island's humiliation and moral collapse. Kiko felt the judgment like a physical blow. A woman, her mother's age, carrying a listless child, turned her head and spat pointedly onto the ground near Kiko's feet. Kiko recoiled. She had survived the systematic abuse of her own army and the terrifying arrival of the devils. She had been shown mercy by the enemy. Now, she faced the contempt of her own people. Instinctively, she pulled the gray wool blanket higher, covering the lower half of her face, hiding behind the coarse, military-issue wool. It was a shield, not against the cold, but against the eyes. She felt utterly, profoundly alone, an outcast from every world. She had no one. A soldier pointed them toward a segregated, empty tent at the far edge of the compound, near the latrines. Kiko walked quickly, her gaze fixed on the muddy ground, the smell of the American wool and insect repellent in her nostrils. It was, sickeningly, the only comfort she had. She sat inside the tent for a full day, the blanket around her shoulders, listening to the camp's alien sounds. The next afternoon, a new sound cut through the din. A medical team was making rounds, checking for dysentery and typhus. A voice, speaking English with practiced authority, moved closer. Kiko looked listlessly through the tent flap. There, walking down the crowded lane, was the corpsman. He was cleaner now, shaven, his helmet replaced by a simple cap, but it was unquestionably him. He was checking the tongues of children, his medical bag slung over his shoulder. He stopped, made a note on a clipboard, and looked up, his eyes scanning the tents. And then he saw her. He recognized her. He paused, his expression unreadable, before a soldier called his name, and he turned to move on. It was a Sunday. Kiko knew this only because the activity in the American sector of the camp changed. The usual din of trucks, shouted commands, and patrols subsided, replaced by a strange new set of sounds. From her isolated tent near the wire fence, Kiko had a clear view of the American compound, separated from the civilian misery by a wide, muddy road. She sat on the ground, the gray wool blanket draped over her legs, her arm now a dull, healing ache instead of a burning fire. The first sound she registered was music. It was not the mournful enka or the strident military marches she was used to. This was brassy, rhythmic, and impossibly energetic. A horn section soared over a driving drumbeat. It was swing music, blaring from a large radio someone had set up on a crate. It sounded loud and carefree, an almost insulting display of cheer in the middle of such desolation. Then she saw the game. On a cleared patch of ground, a group of young soldiers, stripped to their olive drab undershirts, were playing baseball. They were laughing, shouting insults at each other, kicking up dust as they ran bases. They were loud, rough, and completely absorbed in the game. They looked less like the devils from the radio and more like oversized, boisterous schoolboys. Kiko watched, mesmerized. The propaganda had prepared her for monsters. It had not prepared her for their hobbies. Further down, near a larger tent, a different ritual was underway. A chaplain, wearing a white stole over his uniform, stood before a makeshift altar built from ammunition boxes. Soldiers sat on benches, their helmets placed respectfully on the ground beside them, their heads bowed. Kiko could hear the distant, harmonized sound of them singing a hymn. Devils did not sing to their god. Her worldview, already fractured, was now disintegrating. The radio had lied, not just about their actions, but about their very nature. They were not a singular, monstrous entity. They were men. They played games, they listened to strange music, and they prayed. She sat there for hours, watching this bizarre, mundane spectacle of the enemy at peace. Later that afternoon, the baseball game over, the compound grew quiet. Kiko saw him, the corpsman. He was not on duty. He was sitting alone on the hood of a parked jeep, away from the others, writing on a small pad of paper, a letter home. He looked different, without the urgency of the battle, or the detached professionalism of his medical rounds. He looked young and terribly weary, just as he had in the farmhouse. He paused his writing, rubbing the back of his neck, and his gaze drifted across the compound, over the wire fence, toward the civilian tents. His eyes met Kiko's. She froze. He looked at her for a long moment. She was just another internee, a face in the crowd he had treated. But he seemed to remember. He did not smile. He did not wave. He simply, almost imperceptibly, gave a small civil nod of acknowledgement, the kind of gesture one human being gives another. Then he returned to his letter. Kiko looked down at her hands. Tucked into the pocket of the salvaged dress she had been given was the small, empty glass vial the penicillin had come in. She had found it on the floor of the farmhouse and kept it, though she did not know why. She rolled the smooth glass between her fingers. It was not a souvenir. It was evidence. Evidence that these men, who played and prayed and wrote letters home, were capable of a kindness her own people had denied her. The realization left her feeling hollow, confused, and utterly adrift. Weeks bled into one another. The relentless Okinawan summer rains turned the camp into a sea of red mud. Kiko's arm healed. The angry purple subsided to a dull red scar, a thin, jagged line that would forever mark her. The penicillin had worked its magic, and the camp's meager but regular rations of rice and canned fish had slowly restored some of her strength. She kept the gray wool blanket folded neatly in her small space, a talisman of a moment she still could not fully comprehend. She had been assigned to a work detail, mending torn tents. It was mindless work, and it kept her hands busy. One morning, the corpsman came through the camp for a final round of checks before his unit was scheduled to rotate out. Kiko saw him approaching her tent. He was not there for her, but for a cluster of new arrivals who were showing signs of dysentery. As he worked, Kiko sat mending a canvas flap, watching him from a distance. She saw the same clinical efficiency, the same impersonal yet undeniable care. A new figure emerged from the men's quarters. He was a Japanese Imperial Army officer, one of the few who had been captured rather than dying by his own hand. He was emaciated, his uniform hanging on his frame, but he still carried himself with a rigid, bitter pride. He watched the corpsman working, his face a mask of contempt. His gaze then shifted, landing on Kiko. He saw her watching the American. He saw the gray wool blanket folded by her side. He recognized her as one of those women, and he saw her attention as a form of collaboration. "Uragiramono," he hissed, his voice low but carrying. "Traitor." Kiko flinched, her needle stopping mid-stitch. The officer stepped closer, his eyes burning with a zealot's fury. "Look at you. The gaijin saved you? You take his medicine, you take his blanket. Have you no shame? You are Japanese. It is better to die than to accept the pity of these beasts." Kiko's blood ran cold. This man wore the same uniform as the ones who had forced her into the farmhouse. He spoke of honor, but she remembered the smell of sake and the splintered doorframe. He called the American a beast, yet the beast had been the one to offer medicine. Her first instinct was to cower, to look away, to accept the shame as her due. It was the ingrained response. But the corpsman, hearing the raised, angry voice, looked up. His work on the new arrivals was finished. He stood, packing his bag, his eyes falling on Kiko and the glowering Japanese officer. He did not understand the words, but he understood the tension. He looked at Kiko, his expression neutral, ready to move on. In that moment, Kiko had to make a choice. She could bow to the officer's venom, reinforcing the old world of shame and silence, or she could acknowledge the truth she had experienced. The officer spat again. "You shame your ancestors." Kiko's hands tightened on the canvas. Slowly, deliberately, she put her needle down. She rose to her feet, ignoring the Japanese officer as if he were not there. She turned her full attention to the American corpsman. She looked him directly in the eye, a breach of her old etiquette, but she held his gaze. Then, placing her hands flat on her thighs, she executed a perfect, deep, formal Japanese bow. It was not the bow of a subordinate to a master. It was not the bow of a captive to a victor. It was the bow of one human being to another, in gesture of profound, heartbreaking respect. The corpsman, startled, watched her. He was a young man from Ohio. He did not understand the nuances of keirai, but he understood, implicitly, what the gesture cost her in that camp, in front of that officer. He hesitated, then gave a short, awkward nod in return. He shouldered his bag. "Ma'am," he said, the words sounding strange in the muddy camp. He turned and walked away. Kiko rose, her back straight. The Japanese officer stared at her, his face pale with disbelief and rage. Kiko turned away from him, picked up her sewing, and began to stitch. The choice had been made. The war ended not with a bang, but with a piece of paper. It was autumn. The relentless humidity of summer had finally broken, replaced by a crisp, clear air that carried the scent of wood smoke and the sea. The Emperor's voice, tinny and strained, had been broadcast over the camp loudspeakers weeks ago. The fighting was over. Now, the camp was no longer a place of internment, but of processing. Kiko stood in a line that snaked across the bare compound, waiting. Her arm was fully healed, leaving only a pale, jagged scar, a permanent map of her trauma. She had heard nothing of her family. Koza, her village, was spoken of only in the past tense. There was nothing to go back to. There was only forward. When she reached the front of the line, an American administrator, his face weary from processing thousands of displaced souls, looked at her papers. He stamped them with a sharp final thud and handed her a small packet of K-rations and a new identification card. "You are free to go," he said, not unkindly, gesturing with his thumb toward the open gate. Free. The word felt thin, hollow. She had been free when she was forced into the farmhouse. She had been free when she bowed to the corpsman. Kiko took the rations and the paper. She walked toward the gate, the same gate she had entered as a terrified, feverish victim. She paused in the shadow of the guard tower, now unmanned. She looked down at her possessions. She had nothing. The clothes she wore were surplus, donated. The rations in her hand were a day's worth of life, and under her other arm, folded with meticulous care, was the gray wool blanket. It was worn now, the fibers fuzzed from months of use. She had washed it dozens of times in the camp's cold water troughs, and it had never lost its faint, hang scent of American wool and chemicals. She thought of the officer's hissed word, traitor. It would be so easy to leave the blanket behind, to discard this final, tangible piece of the enemy, to walk out as only Japanese. To carry it was to carry the story, the shame, the confusion. A cool morning breeze swept through the compound and she shivered. She stopped. She looked at the blanket, not as a symbol, but as an object. It was heavy. It was warm. It had been given to her in a moment of profound shock, a gesture that had cost the giver nothing, and yet had meant everything. The corpsman, whose face was already blurring in her memory, had not been acting as an American. The young soldier who tossed it to her had not been acting as a victor. They had been acting as men, responding to a human being's suffering. Kindness, she realized, had no flag. It had no uniform. It was just kindness. Kiko unfolded the gray wool blanket. She did not leave it. She did not hide it. She draped it deliberately over her own shoulders. It was not a flag of surrender. It was her armor. She looked down one last time at the small, empty glass penicillin vial she still kept in her pocket. She closed her hand around it, feeling its smooth, cool shape, then pushed it deep into the cloth. Kika took a breath of the clean, cold air. She turned her back on the empty tent and stepped out of the gate, leaving the wire behind. The muddy road stretched out before her. In the far distance, on the hill where Koza used to be, she could see the raw, skeletal frames of new structures being built. She heard, faint on the wind, the rhythmic, steady sound of hammers. She pulled the wool blanket tighter and began to walk.